Right, so it looks like Benjamin Netanyahu might be getting his wish of that wider war in the Middle East. He attacks Gaza, decimates it. Attacks in the West Bank continue as well, along with plans to annex the whole of the West Bank appear to be moving forward. And the ceasefire in Lebanon isn't worth the paper it's printed on, as Israel have now violated that over 140 times. But the bit that requires focus now is where it comes to Syria. Despite pushing back the so-called Syrian rebels, backed by Israel and Turkey amongst others, formerly Al-Qaeda, as these rebels actually are, with the aid of Russia in areas such as Aleppo, though that fight goes on, they continue to lose ground elsewhere in places like Hama and Homs to the south. Well, now it appears that Syria is about to be joined in fighting these rebels by Iraq and Iran, which would mark a significant escalation, and with Iran potentially formally joining the fight on at least one front. Could this mean that something Netanyahu has been wishing for years could finally come to pass, and see the US formally get involved in fighting them going forwards? There might be signs of something like that happening already. Right, so the situation in Syria, which was beginning to look up with Russian involvement at one point, has not turned the tide quite as hoped to calm things down, as the Syrian rebels, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, shortened to HTS, a UN-designated terrorist organisation born out of the remnants of the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and led by the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, have taken the town of Hama and have advanced south towards Homs, Syria's third largest city. Where the centrist pundits around the world are trying to sell a vision of these brave rebels liberating towns and cities in Syria from the oppressive regime of Bashar al-Assad, they are not rebels or liberators. They are terrorists in the most literal sense of the word. They are Al-Qaeda, for heaven's sake. And they are being backed by Israel, by Turkey, and by the US. They have Ukrainians fighting with them as well. So it becomes a new front in the Russia-Ukraine war. Except here, Ukraine are fighting with Israel, backed terrorists, and Russia are fighting in aid of the Syrian government, which you can absolutely hate and critique and slam, and legitimately so, on a wide number of reasons. But it is also the legitimate government fighting Al-Qaeda. So pick your poison, but pick it carefully. The same terrorist organisation that took down the Twin Towers on 9/11, now under a new name, enjoys US backing. Hama taken, Homs next. The rebel terrorists can keep moving down the M5 international highway down towards Damascus itself, which would effectively split Syria in two and cut Hezbollah off from its allies in Iran. It would effectively surround Lebanon, leaving their people no place to flee once again, once this sham of a ceasefire ends that Israel are abusing anyway. Syria is central in the Middle East and is an essential part of any route for Iran to deliver aid and arms or whatever else to their allies in Hezbollah in Lebanon. To destroy Iran's land link to Lebanon would be a massive victory for Israel and its allies. There's no other route for them except through Syria. Lebanon's only land borders are with Syria and Israel, and for Iran to reach Israel would require passing through Jordan, who simply wouldn't have that, not with their pro-Western ties. It's an academic alternative in practice. It would never work. So this is how crucial Syria is. North of Syria lies Turkey, who are backing HTS as well, who are maintaining oil supplies through their country to Israel. So for all of Erdogan's claims of supporting Palestine, he's doing the total opposite. And he's made a recent speech saying it's Assad's fault he's backing Al-Qaeda to take over Syria, because Assad wouldn't return his calls. Ah, poor baby. So he hopes these moderate rebels, as he's calling them, then march on Homs and then Damascus. He's talking about Al-Qaeda as moderate, but he's just another overblown, egotistical idiot interfering in another country he thinks he's entitled to have a say over. Therefore, with things looking rather grim right now, it is perhaps no surprise that Iran are now looking at taking a more proactive role in matters in Syria. For Syria to be taken out by the West would completely destabilise the Middle East, would leave Lebanon far more vulnerable to Israeli assault and conquest in theory, and Iraq are in agreement. After all, they are next if these rebels choose to expand beyond Syria, and given who their backers are, that seems not at all impossible. Yesterday, a tripartite meeting was held by the foreign ministers of Iraq, Iran and Syria in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad, Fuad Hussein, Abbas Araghchi and Bassem Savag, respectively. Here's an excerpt from the Cradle covering that meeting. There is an international duty to fight terrorism in Syria, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said during the press conference. The Foreign Minister thanked Baghdad for hosting the tripartite meeting in the Iraqi capital, where he held important meetings with the presidencies in Iraq, in which he talked about relations between the two countries and the situation in Syria. The message of today's tripartite meeting has three messages. The first of which is to support Syria, government and people, against the armed terrorist groups. Whoever wishes to avoid the interference of the Zionist entity in this situation in Syria is mistaken, Aragchi added. We announced our support for Syria. We will continue this support with all our weight. The terrorist threats in Syria will not be limited to it only, but will extend to neighbouring countries if they are not fought, he warned. Terrorism knows no borders, and terrorists must be fought in their cradle. There is no distinguishing when fighting terrorism. Iraqi Foreign Minister Fuad Hussein said during the conference that his country will send humanitarian aid to Syria, while affirming Baghdad's efforts to convene an international conference on the situation. We will take all diplomatic steps with Arab countries and have already contacted the foreign ministers of Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt and several European nations. These discussions are ongoing, Hussein said. Syrian Foreign Minister Bassem Saud said terrorists are violating the resolutions of the UN and the Security Council. Interventions in Syria are now exposed, adding that there has been wide support for Syria in the fight against terrorism and the rejection of double standards, while thanking Baghdad for hosting the meetings. The warning from Iran certainly is that these armed groups, should they gain a foothold in Syria, will not limit themselves to Syria and will spread to Syria's neighbours, which include not only Lebanon but Turkey, which would just go to prove what an absolute whopper Erdogan is for backing these terrorists. That would be karma if they decided to invade southern Turkey at that point. But also Iraq and Jordan would no longer be safe either. Should that, of course, happen, we need to make sure those backing these terrorists are pointed out and held to account, because I guarantee mainstream media won't. Because not only would that include Netanyahu and Erdogan, but it would also include the US and anybody allying them at the time. Iraq, for its part, has already started amassing troops on its border with Syria, the popular mobilisation units, which I spoke about the other day in another video, allies to the axis of resistance, as the West likes to call allies of Iran, yet also a semi-branch of Iraq's military. They've got government recognition as well. And this seems to have provoked HTS's warlord boss al-Jazari, and perfectly understandably, since the PMU in no small part handed ISIS its backside on a plate back in 2017 and sent him and his ilk running for the hills, so to speak. Al-Jazani sent a video message via his Telegram channel saying that Iraq should decouple itself from events in Syria, that what is happening in Syria will not spill over into Iraq, stating that the Syrian revolution, as he refers to his actions, is not interested in Iraq's internal affairs, and that he hopes that Iraq will prevent the PMU from interfering in Syria. He also stated his desire for strategic, economic and political relations between Syria and Iraq, presumably once he's taken over. Yeah, well, even if Iraq were so inclined, Iran certainly wouldn't be. And I don't believe Iraq are so inclined, increasingly fed up with US presence in their own country, Islamic resistance having already struck US bases in Syria with the threat of doing so in Iraq too, Islamic resistance being Iraq-based. And besides, this would be entering into diplomatic relations with Al-Qaeda at the end of the day. Far more likely is that Netanyahu finally gets his wish, and if Iran and Iraq do end up going into Syria, well, that's his wider war then functionally having started. Everything will have just escalated several times over, all in one fell swoop. These are far larger nations than Israel, the state of Palestine and Lebanon. This would be the entire Middle East pretty much by this point. If you thought I'd forgotten about Jordan here as well, though, well, what have they been up to and what are Western nations up to as well? Because these two questions conveniently come together. This brings us back firstly to that British RAF base on Cyprus, RAF Akrotiri. We know flights have been leaving Cyprus on missions to Israel and Gaza. We know roughly half the intelligence flights over Palestine have been carried out by British spy planes. And yesterday morning a fascinating flight took place, as captured by declassified UK's Matt Kennard, with a bit of video footage here, showing the plane leaving RAF Akrotiri, heading southeast before crossing into Israeli airspace, then into Jordan, pulling a 90-degree turn before disappearing just as it approached the Syrian border. According to Kennard, this was a Voyager KC-3 military transport plane which turned its transponder off just as it approached Syrian airspace. Nothing at all suspicious in that, I'm sure you agree, and therefore we do not know where it actually ended up landing. So was this an RAF plane carrying, what, troops or aid then? This plane can carry 291 personnel or a £90,000 payload. So is this aid for Al-Qaeda? Because I think we deserve to know. We deserve to know if a British RAF base is being used to aid terrorists, because that is what this actually looks like, isn't it? The US are backing them, and we never do anything that doesn't back the US, it seems. So surely there is no other explanation here. We're owed one, though. That Jordan was allowing its airspace for this too, nails on their side in this too. They need to explain their actions in light of this flight as much as the UK government does, to my mind. Meanwhile, Syria is not the only country finding itself with some potential new allies, though, as the Houthis in Yemen have some too, and once again Iraq come into this story. The interconnectivity between different Middle Eastern groups from different nations and how they are all, in their own ways, coming together to oppose Israel and their allies, which now include Al-Qaeda. Get all the details of that development in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please support the channel with a like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already. It is very much appreciated, and I do seek to keep you informed, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.